At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the desert of New Mexico turned into a second sun. The Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon in human history, lit up the sky over the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. Historians note the physicists who built the bomb watched it in awe and dread. But the soldiers who would spend the next 17 years standing in the fallout of similar blasts, they were never given the choice to feel awe. They were given an order, and then a threat. Between 1945 and 1962, researchers estimate that somewhere between 235,000 and 550,000 American service members witnessed or participated in above-ground nuclear weapons testing. Over 200 detonations in total, according to accounts compiled by military historians. Some watched from trenches just miles from ground zero. Others walked through the wreckage afterward, close enough to see their own shadows burned into the sand. One of them was a young sailor named John Smitherman, present at the 1946 Bikini Atoll tests, detonations so contaminating that the lagoon itself became a symbol of the atomic age. Another was Gilly Jenkins, a 17-year-old Navy recruit from Virginia who enlisted expecting a normal posting, and instead found himself assigned to something called Special Projects. According to his family's later accounts, that meant Operation Crossroads, the Marshall Islands, a Geiger counter checked multiple times a day, and a silence that would follow him for the rest of his life. These men weren't briefed on radiation. Many historians argue the science of long-term fallout exposure wasn't even fully understood by the officers giving the orders. What was clear, and made explicit, was this: talk about what you saw, and you could go to prison. This is the detail that separates the atomic veterans from almost every other group in American military history. According to veterans advocacy organizations, they were bound by an oath of secrecy, unlike anything else on record, forbidden not just from discussing classified tactics, but from telling their own wives, their own doctors, their own children what had happened to them. Veteran Pac Watts, who was sent to witness detonations in the Marshall Islands, later described the absurdity of it. The tests were broadcast on television, newspapers covered them, and yet he says he was still forbidden from confirming, even to his own family, that he had been there at all. My wife and my family had no idea where I was or what I did until 1996, he has said in interviews. Think about what that means. A man comes home from watching a nuclear bomb detonate close enough to feel the heat on his skin, and he cannot say a word about it. Not to explain the nightmares, not to explain the cancer that shows up years later. Some doctors, according to accounts from surviving veterans, assumed these men had worked in mines or smoked heavily, because there was no other explanation on record for what was appearing in their lungs and their blood. The veterans simply had to let the doctors believe it. Epidemiological studies, referenced by the Department of Veterans Affairs, have linked radiation exposure among these veterans to leukemia, a range of cancers, and cataracts, among other conditions. And here is one of the cruelest details of this story. In 1973, a fire at the National Archives destroyed the only surviving service and medical records for many of these men. For some veterans, there was no longer any paper trail connecting their illness to their service, only their word, which they had been legally forbidden to give for 50 years. By the time Congress moved to lift the secrecy, thousands of atomic veterans had already died, many, historians note, without ever telling their own families what they had witnessed or endured. The silence didn't lift all at once. In 1983, President Reagan signed a proclamation naming July 16th National Atomic Veterans Day, but it applied to that single year only, not to the ones that followed. The recognition evaporated almost as soon as it was granted. It took until the mid-1990s for real change to begin. In 1995, President Clinton issued a formal apology to the nation's atomic veterans. And in 1996, Congress repealed the Nuclear Radiation and Secrecy Agreements Act, finally freeing these men, most now in their 60s and 70s, to say out loud what they had spent their entire adult lives holding in. It would take another 25 years before the recognition became permanent. In 2021, legislation introduced by Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, whose own district included veterans like Gilly Jenkins, was signed into law, requiring a presidential proclamation honoring atomic veterans every single year, not just once. In 2022, the Atomic Veterans Service Medal was formally established, allowing survivors, and the families of those who had already passed, to apply for recognition that had been withheld for generations. According to the National Association of Atomic Veterans, by 2025, an estimated 400 of these veterans were believed to still be alive, out of hundreds of thousands. There's something worth sitting with here. This wasn't secrecy in the name of protecting troops in an active war. This was secrecy that outlasted the war, outlasted the Cold War, and in most cases, outlasted the men themselves, kept not to protect anyone still in danger, but to protect a program from scrutiny. The soldiers who carried that secret weren't spies. They were teenagers and young men who followed orders, stood in a desert or on a coral atoll, and watched something no human being had ever been meant to see up close. And then they were told, "You were never here."
That's the story of the atomic veterans. They kept a secret for 50 years, not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. Some never got to tell their families the truth. Some died still keeping that promise. Today, we remember them, not as numbers, as people. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.